When bounty hunter Lee Van Cleef came to collect his $500 reward, the sheriff hesitated. "Is this man really guilty?" he asked. Van Cleef narrowed his eyes. "He's guilty because they pay me to say so." But the detail the sheriff showed him in the file shook Van Cleef's certainty. The town of Tombstone, at the edge of the Arizona desert, dozed in the afternoon heat. Lee Van Cleef dismounted his horse and led his prisoner toward the sheriff's office. His long black coat left tracks in the dusty road. Van Cleef's cold blue eyes reflected no emotion. In his 20-year bounty hunter career, he had captured thousands of criminals. This was just another one. The prisoner was a young man, about 30 years old, brown-haired, tired-looking. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but instead of fear, there was sadness in his eyes. "Sheriff Morrison," said Van Cleef, pushing through the office door. "I brought you a gift." Sheriff Morrison looked up from his desk, a 50-year-old, portly, well-meaning man. He frowned when he saw Van Cleef. "Lee Van Cleef? Again?" Van Cleef pushed the prisoner into a chair. "Thomas Bradley, first-degree murder. Reward, $500. The sheriff opened the file, flipped through the pages. "Is this man really guilty?" Van Cleef's eyes narrowed. A cold smile appeared on his lips. "He's guilty because they pay me to say so, Morrison." But the sheriff showed Van Cleef a detail in the file. "Look at this. Witness statements don't match. Timeline doesn't add up." Van Cleef looked at the file. For the first time, his certainty wavered. Thomas Bradley sat quietly, not talking, not crying, not pleading. This caught Van Cleef's attention. Most criminals either got angry or cried when caught. "Why are you silent?" asked Van Cleef. Thomas looked up. His eyes were clear, honest. "Because I have nothing to say. You won't believe me anyway." Van Cleef turned a chair around, sat backwards. "Try me." Thomas took a deep breath. "I was in San Antonio that night. My wife was sick. I was waiting at Dr. Williams's clinic." "You have proof?" Thomas pulled out a paper from his pocket. It was a prescription with the doctor's seal. The date showed the night of the murder. Van Cleef examined the paper. It looked real. But making fake documents wasn't difficult either. "Where is Dr. Williams?" "He died last month, heart attack." Van Cleef looked at Sheriff Morrison. Morrison shrugged. "Very convenient," said Van Cleef. "Your only witness is dead." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "This isn't coincidence. Someone is framing me." Van Cleef decided to investigate in town. His 20 years of experience told him something wasn't right. His first stop was the crime scene, a small house outside town. The victim was an elderly farmer named Samuel Patterson. Van Cleef examined the house. The door was forced, the inside was messy. But something was missing, signs of struggle. "Strange," Van Cleef muttered. "The old man never fought back." Neighbors said they heard strange sounds that night, but no one had seen the attacker. Van Cleef went to the town bar. Bartender Jake remembered the night of the murder. "Do you know Thomas Bradley?" asked Van Cleef. "Of course," said Jake. "Good kid. His wife was sick. He was very worried." Was he here that night? Jake thought. He had gone to San Antonio, to the doctor. This supported Thomas's story. Van Cleef became even more suspicious. Van Cleef went to San Antonio. He found Dr. Williams's clinic. The doctor was dead, but his secretary still worked there. "Do you remember anyone that night?" asked Van Cleef. "Thomas Bradley?" The secretary's face brightened. "Yes." Poor man, his wife was very sick. He waited until midnight. Van Cleef's heart stopped. Thomas was truly innocent. But then, who was the real killer? Van Cleef re-examined the murder file. One detail caught his attention. Samuel Patterson had money in the bank. A lot of money. He spoke with the bank manager. Who could access Patterson's account? Only himself. or his nephew? His nephew? Yes, Robert Patterson, Samuel's only heir. Van Cleef investigated Robert Patterson. The man was a gambling addict with large debts. Van Cleef found Robert Patterson at the town's gambling house, a young, anxious-looking man, desperate to pay his debts. Robert Patterson. The man turned. He tensed when he saw Van Cleef. Yes, who are you? Lee Van Cleef, bounty hunter. I want to talk about your uncle's death. Robert's face paled. I don't know anything about that. Van Cleef studied Robert's eyes. His 20 years of experience told him the man was lying. Where were you that night, Robert? At home, sleeping. Do you have a witness? Robert hesitated. No. I live alone. Van Cleef continued pressuring Robert. Finally, the man broke down. Okay, I did it, but it wasn't intentional. Van Cleef wasn't surprised. Tell me. I went to ask my uncle for money. He refused. We argued. I pushed him. He fell, hit his head. He was dead. Then you robbed the house. Blame Thomas Bradley? Robert nodded, crying. I'm desperate. My creditors will kill me. Van Cleef brought Robert to the sheriff's office. Thomas Bradley was released. Thomas thanked Van Cleef. Without you, I would have been hanged. Van Cleef lit his cigarette. Business is business. But inside, he felt something different. For the first time, he had considered justice alongside money. Sheriff Morrison gave Van Cleef the $500 reward. Extra reward for catching the real killer. Van Cleef gave the money to Thomas. For your wife, medical expenses. Thomas was surprised. Why? Van Cleef narrowed his eyes. Because you're innocent, and I don't work just for money anymore. After this incident, Van Cleef's approach changed. He no longer looked only at the reward amount. He investigated whether the crime was real. His reputation in town grew. He became known as the fair bounty hunter. People trusted him. One day, a young man came. Mr. Van Cleef, my father is wrongly wanted. Will you help? Van Cleef narrowed his eyes. What's the reward? I have no money, but my father is innocent. Van Cleef thought for a long time. Then he stood up. Let's go. Van Cleef began investigating his new case. This time he was working for justice, not money. In the past, he only caught targets. Now he also sought truth. This change earned him new enemies. Some bounty hunters thought he had gone soft. But Van Cleef didn't care, because now he slept better at night. After the Thomas Bradley case, his conscience was clear. For the first time, he considered truth alongside money. Van Cleef's change disturbed his old rivals. Jake Blackhawk Wheeler was his biggest enemy. Lee Van Cleef has gone soft, Wheeler mocked. Now he seeks justice. Wheeler challenged Van Cleef. Old-style duel. Winner becomes the only bounty hunter in Tombstone. Van Cleef accepted the offer, but this time he fought not just for pride, but for the town's safety. The duel took place on Main Street. The whole town watched. Wheeler was fast, but Van Cleef was more accurate. One bullet was enough. Wheeler fell to the ground. Van Cleef holstered his gun. Now there's only one rule here: justice. Years passed. Lee Van Cleef became Tombstone's legendary bounty hunter, but now he worked for what was right, not just for money. Thomas Bradley continued building a happy life with his wife. Every year he sent a thank you letter to Van Cleef. Van Cleef kept the letters. They were as valuable as money to him, because now he understood. True wealth was having a clean conscience. One evening, a young bounty hunter came. Master, will you teach me your techniques? Van Cleef narrowed his eyes. First rule, money isn't everything. Second rule, truth always comes out. Third rule, justice is stronger than revenge. The young man took notes. And the last rule, said Van Cleef, Never abandon an innocent person, because one day you might be innocent too. When Van Cleef grew old, he had no regrets about his past. After the Thomas Bradley case, his life had changed. Now the sign read, Lee Van Cleef Justice Office. People came not just to catch criminals, but to protect the innocent. Van Cleef's last words were, "I spent years chasing money, but the real treasure was a clean conscience." And the town of Tombstone remembered him not just as a tough bounty hunter, but as a fair man. Because Van Cleef had learned, true power was defending what's right. If this story moved you, if you believe that money isn't everything and that true power lies in justice, then this channel is for you. At Wild West Love Stories, you discover not just romantic stories, but tales of justice, friendship, and transformation. Subscribe and meet us in the next story, because here, every story is also a story of change.